Greetings, dear viewers. Today we will tell you the amazing story of how Ford's ambitious project turned into one of the most famous failures in the history of the automotive industry. But it was this failure, known as the Edsel, that became the catalyst for the creation of the legendary Ford Mustang. This story began innocently enough. The Ford Corporation had been looking to expand its lineup of automobile brands since the late 1940s. At one of the company's board meetings, some members expressed concern that many customers were eventually switching to General Motors and Chrysler. The reason was obvious: marketing mistakes. At General Motors, the brand hierarchy was organized so that customers could gradually move up the social ladder, starting with Chevrolet and moving to the more expensive Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and finally Cadillac. Chrysler had a similar system, from Plymouth to Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler, and Imperial. Ford had only 3 tiers: the Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln. If buyers couldn't afford a Mercury, they often went to Pontiac or Dodge dealers. Those who could buy a Mercury were faced with a large price difference between that brand and Lincoln. Thus, customers were back at General Motors and Chrysler, leaving Ford behind. This problem, which had started since the days of Henry Ford, needed a solution. The most logical solution was to surround the Mercury brand with additional models, cheaper and more expensive, under a new brand. So, in the early 1950s, a project was launched, later named after the son of the company founder. The hype around the new brand began long before its official introduction. The PR department could hardly contain the excitement, which only fueled the interest. On August 7, 1956, the company finally announced the name of the new brand and its plans. Experts in the car business were amazed. A major manufacturer with a network of 1,400 dealers was creating another network to sell a new model line. This was an unprecedented case in the history of the car business. However, a problem immediately arose. Many experienced dealers did not want to deal with the new brand. Therefore, any entrepreneur who agreed to work with it was presented by Ford's advertising department as a national hero. All this was done so that the buyer immediately felt the exclusivity of the Edsel brand and its difference from Ford and Mercury. By the summer of 1957, the American public was overwhelmed by an advertising campaign in support of a new car from Ford. No one had ever seen these cars before, but almost every person knew it was something unique. $250 million was spent on the campaign. Edsel headquarters, located in a new building, constantly fed the press with sensational statements, for example, about plans to sell at least 200,000 cars in the first year. 5 plants were urgently equipped to fulfill this plan, and a 6th was ready in case of high demand. Finally, on September 4, 1957, the long-awaited cars of the new brand were presented to the public. However, the raptures and applause did not follow. The 3 million Americans who attended the premiere left disappointed. They felt deceived. Despite the assurances of Ford advertisers that the Edsel models were completely new, the Ranger, Pacer, and station wagon series had easily recognizable features of the Ford Fairlane. The more prestigious Corsair and Citation models were merely redesigned Mercury. Where was the promised automobile of the future? In fact, only a fraction of the amount went into designing the Edsel lineup. The rest of the money was spent on the advertising campaign. The management decided to present the cars as the last word in technology, instead of making them so from the beginning. Although the Edsel was originally planned to be original, this plan was rejected as too complicated. Instead of developing new engines and bodies, they decided to redesign the current models. Designers carried out the directive to make the Edsel cars unlike any other. In this they succeeded. The cars became known as the ugliest cars in the world. How could they give the new family the look of expensive, unique cars if they remained essentially the same Ford and Mercury? Stylists gave the Edsel cars a vertical radiator trim, believing it would be associated with the luxurious Packard of the war years. But the public compared the Edsel's face not with a noble Packard, but with a horse skull. Design is a subtle thing. Perhaps, in time, the public would get used to the unusual appearance and love it. Technically, the cars were not bad. They even offered an innovation: selection of automatic mode by buttons on the steering wheel. The Edsel's main problem was the unfortunate timing of its market entry. If in 1954, when the work on the project was in full swing, the middle-class cars accounted for 40% of the market, then by the fall of 1957, the demand for such models fell by half. The economic crisis forced buyers to switch from luxury sedans to more economical cars, such as the Rambler American or Volkswagen Beetle. Adding to the economic woes were rumors about the low quality of Edsel cars. There were grounds for this. The new division, although listed as an independent unit within the Ford Motor Company, had no authority over the factories that produced its cars. These 5 plants, which caused Ford a lot of trouble, assembled cars and parts at the end of each hour. Workers who were just assembling Ford cars did not have time to readjust to the peculiarities of the Edsel models, which had a negative impact on quality. Meanwhile, Ford and Mercury bosses were demanding that the division be paid for every car produced, without regard to poor quality. Edsel production was declining. 3,730 cars were produced in July 1957, 20,000 in August, several thousand more in September, and then due to overcrowded warehouses, production was reduced to 2,000 per month. The result was 63,000 cars in the first model year, 3 times less than planned. Ford Motors management was gripped by panic. In January 1958, Mercury and Lincoln merged into one division, and the Edsel's main advertising slogan was economy. By the 1959 season, the expensive Pacer and Citation series were removed from the catalog because they had to be sold at almost the same prices as Mercury, which was hurting the corporation. Buyers were forced to choose between models from the same manufacturer. The remaining station wagons and the Pacer and Corsair series were further unified with Ford products. It became clear that Edsel no longer competed with Buick and DeSoto, but offered luxury equipment at the prices of cheap Ford, Plymouth, and Chevrolet. Now, instead of large-scale promotional efforts, Ford Motor Company was allocating funds to dealers for local promotions. However, nothing could save the brand anymore. It was required to sell 650 cars a day to be profitable, but less than 300 were actually sold. The year 1959 ended even worse. About 45,000 cars were sold, which would have been enough for one factory. Despite this, in February 1959, answering questions about the fate of Edsel, Henry Ford II confidently stated that he was not going to curtail the program. He was confident that it would take time to achieve profitability, and the first positive results would be realized with the release of the next season's new models. These models, the station wagon and Ranger series, went on sale October 15, 1959. Now their appearance was almost identical to Ford's. The infamous horse skull was replaced by a modest design that resembled Pontiac styling. Instead of avant-garde came a faint copying of competitors' designs. Eventually, the 1960 model year Edsel ceased to exist before the start of the calendar year. On November 19, 1959, the company announced a reorganization that created the Lincoln Mercury division. On this day, the last Edsel rolled off the assembly line. In 3 years, 110,847 cars of this failed brand were produced, of which the 1960 models totaled only 2,846. The Edsel, which ignominiously left the scene, redeemed itself to the company as the freed-up capacity allowed to increase production of the compact Ford Falcon. This car was the most successful of the first three compacts, including the Chevrolet Corvair and Plymouth Valiant. Later, based on the Falcon, the Ford Mustang was created, the popularity of which broke all records.